The jungle air hung thick and heavy, a humid shroud clinging to the panicked breaths clawing at Robert Muldoon's lungs. He lay splayed against the gnarled root of a giant fern, the acrid metallic tang of his own blood stinging his nostrils. The world spun, a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown, punctuated by the throbbing agony lancing through his left leg. He tasted dirt, the gritty earth clinging to his tongue, a final kiss from the world he'd almost left behind. He'd been stupid, cocky. He'd thought he was the hunter, not the prey. The raptors had disabused him of that notion with brutal efficiency. He remembered the sickening wrench of the traps snapping shut, the high-pitched, chilling scream that sliced through the air like a razor, and then the rush of scaled, muscled fury. He'd emptied his tranquilizer gun, every dart finding its mark in the lead raptor, but it was already too late. The others, flanking him, were on him. Razor-sharp claws raked his side, tearing through fabric and flesh, and the impact of the lead raptor, even momentarily stunned, had sent him crashing into the vegetation. He should be dead. The thought, cold and stark, burrowed into his mind. He'd faced down rebels in Africa, stalked rogue elephants in the Indian jungle, but nothing had prepared him for the concentrated, intelligent ferocity of the velociraptors. They weren't animals. They were something else entirely. Something engineered. He pressed a trembling hand to his side, the searing pain a grim confirmation of his continued existence. Blood seeped between his fingers, a viscous crimson river tracing paths down his ribs. He had to move. Staying put was a death sentence, a banquet laid out for predators who wouldn't need a second invitation. With a grunt that ripped through his vocal cords, he pushed himself up, leveraging himself against the fern root. His leg screamed in protest, a white-hot poker thrust through the muscle. He risked a glance down. Deep lacerations crisscrossed his thigh, but miraculously, no bone jutted through. He'd been lucky, or perhaps unlucky enough to simply be wounded instead of instantly devoured. The jungle was eerily silent now. The raptors were gone, vanished back into the dense foliage as quickly as they had appeared. But Muldoon knew they were out there, watching, waiting. They'd been testing him, he realized, gauging his strength, his resilience. And he'd failed. He'd become the distraction, the sacrificial lamb, just as Hammond, in his infuriatingly optimistic naivety, had never intended. He rummaged in his vest, fingers slick with blood, and found his radio. Static hissed from the speaker, a mocking whisper in the oppressive silence. He thumbed the transmit button. Ranger 1 to base. Ranger 1 to base. Do you read? His voice was hoarse, strained, but laced with a thread of desperate urgency. Silence. Only the crackle of static answered him. Either the radio was damaged, or no one was listening. He tried again, his voice louder this time, pushing past the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. Hammond, Malcolm, anyone. This is Muldoon. Raptor Attack. I'm wounded, but alive. Do you copy? More static. He swore under his breath, a string of colorful epithets he'd picked up in his years in the field. Abandoned. Left for dead. It was the very scenario he'd warned them against. Complacency. Underestimation. And now, he was paying the price. He had to get back to the ranger station. It was his only hope. He knew the layout of the park better than anyone, the service roads, the maintenance tunnels. He could use the terrain to his advantage. But his leg, every step was agony, a fresh wave of pain washing over him. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt, wincing as the movement aggravated his side wound. He bound his leg tightly, a makeshift tourniquet to slow the bleeding and offer a semblance of support. It was a pathetic attempt, but it was all he had. Pushing through the undergrowth, Muldoon began to move. Each step was a battle against pain, against exhaustion, against the primal fear that gnawed at him. He moved slowly, deliberately, using the dense vegetation as cover. He was no longer the hunter. He was now hunted game, relying on instinct and experience to survive. As he limped deeper into the jungle, the sounds of the park began to filter through the ambient noise. The distant roar of a Tyrannosaurus rex, the guttural croaks of herbivores, the unsettling rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The park was alive, a chaotic, untamed ecosystem unleashed upon the world. He reached a service road, a cracked ribbon of asphalt swallowed by encroaching vegetation. It was a gamble, leaving the cover of the jungle, but it was faster, more direct. He started to hobble along the road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He scanned the tree line constantly, his senses on high alert, expecting the return of the raptors at any moment. It seemed like an eternity, but finally, through the trees, he saw it. The familiar silhouette of the ranger station, a beacon of civilization in this prehistoric nightmare. Relief flooded him, so potent it almost knocked him off his feet. He stumbled towards the station, his pace quickening despite the burning in his leg. He reached the perimeter fence, the electrified wire now useless, dangling limply from broken posts. He clambered over the fence, collapsing on the other side, just outside the station doors. The door hissed open, and Hammond stood there, silhouetted against the weak emergency lighting within. Behind him, Muldoon could see Ian Malcolm slumped in a chair, bandages wrapped around his arm, looking even more disheveled and cynical than usual. Hammond's eyes widened in disbelief. Robert? But the raptors? His voice trailed off, his face a mixture of shock and something akin to guilt. They got me, Muldoon croaked, his voice raw. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his legs threatening to buckle. But not quite enough. Malcolm straightened up in his chair, a flicker of surprise in his usually sardonic eyes. Well. The great white hunter returns from the jaws of death. Didn't peg you for the resilient type, Robert. Even wounded and exhausted, Muldoon could detect a hint of genuine respect in Malcolm's tone. Hammond rushed forward, his earlier shock replaced by a flurry of nervous energy. Robert, you're injured. Let's get you inside. We have basic first aid supplies. He helped Muldoon inside, guiding him to a chair. Raptors ambushed me by the east gate, Muldoon said, his voice gaining strength as the initial shock wore off. Trap, just like you said. Clever girls. He managed a grim smile. They were testing me. They knew what they were doing. We assumed, Hammond stammered, his face paling. Ellie made it to the bunker. But Alan and the children, they're still out there. Despair laced his voice. Then we haven't got time to waste, Muldoon said, pushing himself upright. Pain still lanced through his leg and side, but adrenaline began to pump through his veins. Survival was no longer enough. He had a job to do. The raptors won't be satisfied with just scaring me. They'll be bolder now. Confident. They'll be hunting again. Malcolm watched Muldoon with a new intensity. So, what's the plan, Mr. Hunter? Round them up with a lasso and a song. Muldoon ignored the sarcasm. We need to re-establish containment. Or at least, create a perimeter. We need to know where they are, what they're doing. And we need to find Grant and those kids before those damn things do. But how? Hammond wrung his hands, his earlier optimism completely shattered. The fences are down, the power is off, we're practically defenseless. Not entirely, Muldoon said, his eyes hardening. He looked around the ranger station, his gaze settling on the weapons locker in the corner. We still have guns. Tranks, yes, but also something with a little more stopping power. He limped towards the locker, his purpose clear. The distraction was over. Now, it was time to become the hunter once more. He might be wounded, he might be outnumbered, but Robert Muldoon was not going to be prey. Not today. He was going to make sure those clever girls regretted their ambush. He was going to hunt them down, and he was going to bring Grant and the children back. He owed them that much, and he owed himself a reckoning with the creatures who had dared to turn him into a target. The game had changed, and Muldoon was ready to play.